Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Networks Aren't Set It and Forget It Anymore. Today's event is brought to you by SolarWinds and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis, and I'm excited to be your moderator for today's event. Now, on today's event, we have a couple extra expert presenters that I'll be introducing you to here in just a moment. But before we do, we've got a little bit of housekeeping here we first need to cover. We want this to be a really educational event. We've got some great content, and we are hoping for some great questions from you out there in the audience. So use that GoToWebinar questions box there to ask all your questions, and we'll be doing a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the event. We also have a $300 Amazon gift card to give away to one lucky attendee on today's live event. I'm sorry if you're watching this on demand, that drawing has already occurred. Full price terms and conditions can be found at events.actualtechmedia.com. And without further delay, today's presenters are Mr. Kevin M. Sparenberg, Technical Content Manager at SolarWinds, and Mr. Jonathan Petkovich, Senior Product Manager at SolarWinds. Kevin and Jonathan, thanks for being on the event today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, I'll hand control over to Jonathan. And we can get started.
All right, thank you. All right, everyone should be able to see that now.
All right, so that was Jonathan, and I'm Kevin Sparenberg. I'm the Technical Content Manager for THWAC. THWAC is our community forum for SolarWinds, found at thwac.solarwinds.com. I have been using SolarWinds solutions since about mid-2000s, and I've held a multitude of roles over the years. I've been a THWAC MVP on the forums. Some non-technology stuff I like. I do traditional archery, that is with a longbow, yes, with wooden arrows. And I'm an amateur blacksmith, and I'm just getting started with that. And the most important thing probably for this call and anytime I talk to anyone is I've never, ever been in sales.
All right, so I'm Jonathan Petkovich. I'm the product manager for Network Configuration Manager, what we're going to be speaking about today. Some background on me. I've been doing this for over 10 years now. My whole career has been dedicated to building and making products in the monitoring and security space. So anything and all the evolution that's occurred over the last 10 years, I've seen firsthand when on the development side. So it's been quite exciting. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So we have 4 goals that we want to walk through today for each of you. And again, if you have any questions as we go through it, please do ask. We will try to answer those as much as possible as we go through this presentation. So the first off, we want to help answer how to protect your kit investment with scheduled, automated, and real-time configuration backups. This is something that I think we overall feel that is kind of the core function and value out of NCM, and something that it can be missed in many organizations and networks. So it's something we'll talk about and kind of show you some of the value there and how it can help eliminate a lot of that time, a lot of the effort that you would have to do if you're executing it manually, or any of the sort of anxiety you build up doing it on your own. We'll also look at how to make sure your infrastructure is protected from vulnerabilities. This is something that we're all constantly aware of and trying to mitigate as much as possible. They come up every day. So what are some things that we can do from the NCM side to help kind of mitigate that issue as time goes on? Thirdly, we'll go through how to automate the firmware upgrade for each of your devices. So as vulnerabilities come up, what's one way you can help protect it? You can upgrade to the newest versions of firmware that have had those vulnerabilities patched. And the best way to do that is to automate that process, unless you really enjoy updating 100 devices manually over a course of 3 weeks. If you do, okay, great, wonderful. And then lastly, we'll go through how to protect your environment, specifically your infrastructure, with configuration drift. Right? Once you've set something, you expect it to operate a certain way. Things happen, configs change, unintentionally, intentionally. You need to have some management or monitoring around that drift that occurs over time. So firstly, with config backups, NCM is a tool that helps bring some automation to each of these items. So specifically with config, we can automatically version control each of the device's config. So we'll go out, we'll connect to the device based on the profile that you've set up, based on the devices that you want to manage, and we'll automatically extract all of that config information and pull it into NCM. And then we will version control each of those based on a regular backup cadence that you've set up. And we'll walk through some of this so you can see it. I'm just going to talk through each of it. That frequency is completely customizable. It's based on whatever you feel is necessary in your environment. If you have an environment that's changing quite regularly, then you can set a frequency that's more frequent to make sure you're constantly looking at those configs and keeping proper version control.
One of the beauties of that, though, is that since we actually do maintain such a good version control background on that, is that if you happen to pull it back up today and it is identical to the one yesterday, there's literally a checkbox that says, yeah, these are the same. You don't have to keep 2 copies. Just keep the one.
Exactly. That way you don't end up with duplicates of the same information. Why would you need that? And then lastly, you can go ahead and execute on-demand config backup. So if you have an in to change, something's happened, you're like, oh, shoot, I really need to have this current version, and I can't wait till tomorrow just in case something changes. You can go ahead and push that out automatically with NCM.
Yeah, this is probably the saves my bacon feature, as I jokingly said. It's one of the things that I used and relied upon at a previous job where I was one of the networking administrators. And whenever someone made a change, even something small and seems innocuous, like swapping a VLAN on a user port, it sounds silly, but that could accidentally, just from a bad fat finger or a bad copy paste, could put them on an insecure location. You need to make sure you capture that. The other beauty of that particular part is you actually know who did it. So you can just look right at the log and it says change made by such and such, providing you actually use authenticated logins.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Highly advise it.
Yes, please do.
All right, let's go ahead and show you some of what this looks like here. All right. So for those of you that do not know, I'm actually going to show all of this through our public demo, which is online. You can find it at oriondemo.solarwinds.com. You can go interact with it. You can play with it. You can see each of the products that are available there. And you can make some decisions or test some functionality maybe you haven't used before if you're currently using the product.
Yeah, this is actually a demo of all of our Orion-based products, which is one of our core monitoring solutions that provides a common interface. So everything you're seeing is run on top of this core platform. But we're going to concentrate today during this session on the Network Configuration Manager tool.
Exactly. All right, so where I've navigated to, just to make sure everyone followed that, is I went to Network Configuration and I clicked on Configuration Management. What I'm first going to show you is what we do when we pull in that config. And then we'll walk through kind of how you do that, some methods to extrapolate all that. So here we have a list of all of our Cisco devices, which we filtered off on the left-hand side here through our little filter tab. We can group it by various metrics, whichever you determine is important for you in terms of how you want to view it. But once you've added a node, it'll appear here. Once you've downloaded a config, each of those configs will begin to populate in underneath that particular node. And you'll get an indication of the timestamp, so the date and time when it was. So this was June 27th, 4 a.m. Great. It was the startup config. Awesome. Prior to that, we also downloaded the running config from this Cisco box. And if you need to see more, you can go back and you can look. We keep a history, a rolling history. We have about 2 weeks worth of configs, which I think is generally about the maximum you want to keep if you're doing a download every day.
Yeah, that's pretty much a safe standard. Normally, I'm going to say it this way, if a problem happened and it's longer than 2 weeks ago, you've got bigger problems. But for the beauty of this, though, but let's ask a question. Let's say I see the little thing there says mark as a baseline, or I'm sorry, the language says promote to baseline. So if I promote one of these to a baseline, does that baseline roll off after 2 weeks?
No, it stays on until you're done with it.
So basically, I actually have longer than 2 weeks, providing I choose one as kind of my master image for that, or my master config for that particular device.
Yes, and we even do have some more advanced workflows, and if we have time, we can show it with using the favorite flag and doing some things with our compliance rule for even more historical context on things. So there's a lot there that we can do.
Yep, cool.
Great. So, if you want to drill into any one of these, you could click in through here. You can go ahead and look into each. We're not going to do that right now, but it gives you the full context. You can look into the configs content.
And you can look at any of these on the Orion demo. So it's an ungated demo. Just go ahead and play around.
So I had mentioned that you could do the manual backup. So since we're here in this screen, this is actually where you can do your save your bacon workflow, right? So you've already managed a node. Let's envision a scenario. I've already managed a node. Someone has changed that VLAN, and I know that I need to now pull in that backup immediately. Well, all I need to do is click on the node that's of interest. So we'll say it's this first one here. You click download, and you click whichever config that's applied to. So in this case, it would probably be the running. So you just click running, and I think this is going to give me, So it's going to say, go ahead. Are you sure you want to go ahead and download this config? You would click yes, and then the NCM will go out, access the device, pull in the config data, and then you'll see it roll underneath as a newest config here, and you'll have that history immediately on demand when you need it.
Yeah, this is the way that if I used to like to use this just before change windows.
Yes.
because it was just something simple. It's like, yeah, I know they're going to be taking down the network and I want to make sure everything's okay. So you know what? I'm going to back up everything in the Boston office just to be doubly, triply safe. Just filter and change my filters. In this case, I actually had a custom property called site.
Yep.
Change it to Boston, check the boxes, actually check the top one, says select all, download running, download startup, walk away.
Yep.
I know I'm protected.
Yeah, it's a great point. And this is actually, normally these are things you do before firmware upgrade events, but I can show you something with our firmware upgrade later about that too, which is very cool. But yeah, any kind of change window, you can come in here, select them, pull them all in. Great pre and post workflow management solution. All right, great. So once we've got the nodes, once we've done this, we can probably want to set some regular cadence, right? You're not going to want to do this all the time, every morning, wake up at 4 a.m. and go pull this in. That doesn't seem reasonable.
That seems like a very bad job. So let the computer do the job work for you.
So what we'll do is you actually come over to the jobs list, which is, again, under NCM, under network configuration, under jobs. And you'll see a whole host of out-of-the-box jobs that exist currently. And if we look down here, we can see we've got bulk change, we've got daily config, reboot, weekly export. So again, if you're keeping 14 days and you would like to keep a historical record, you can go ahead and export that. We can also do a purge of any config. So again, 14 days, if that's our maximum, we can purge those out. We no longer need to keep those. But one of the other things that we can actually do here is download the configs from the devices. And so this is where you can get really creative with what it is you actually want in your frequency, right? So say you didn't want to do the config backup via the config management on demand. You could come into the jobs and you could create it that way, especially if you're looking to make some sort of dynamic selection of your nodes, right? There's some criteria, maybe it's a region, maybe it's something else that you want to pull.
Maybe it's a model.
It could be a model as well, right? And you want the system to make that decision, not you, right? Just in case you forget to click on one. God forbid you miss one and you've gone ahead and now it's
or this is a good example of, you know what, I've got this one off where I need to do a change window, but I don't want to be up at 2 a.m. when it's local time there. So I said this to run this job this one time for that office based on those criteria or what have you, but then you're not staying awake.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard that story.
Enough.
Yes. So let's say that maybe once isn't why you're here. You're looking to do a daily frequency. So we're going to set it up every weekday. We can do it every day. We'll say every day for this case. If you wanted to do it more sparingly, you could do it under the weekly. You set the days of the week that you're interested in. If you're looking at monthly, typically I wouldn't recommend monthly necessarily unless you have something that's just not changing. It's in some isolated location, but most of the time it's usually a daily frequency for any of the running configs and something around a weekly frequency, once a week to twice a week for any of the startup off of Cisco.
That's a general safe rule most of the time. And that rule becomes just as critical when we talk about real-time change notification.
Yes, it does. So in this case, let's go ahead and click daily, once a day. So this is a little bit where I talked about you could do some of that node selection criteria, right? If you don't want to make this decision yourself, you'd rather the software do it, right? Computers are really good at doing this type of work, so might as well use it to do it. You can still select all of the nodes manually if you felt like that was something you wanted to do.
Boring.
Or you could select all nodes.
Also boring.
That can be a little bit of a pain. Or you can do a dynamic node selection.
This is my favorite because for me is we had a lot of devices that were detected in NCM that we used for inventory collection, but didn't have quote traditional configs. I didn't have CLI style configs, but I still needed them in there for reporting their inventory, what's actually in there through SNMP crawls, which it's a fantastic feature we're not going to talk about today. But I needed to only pull configs from them and I was tired of getting errors in the all logs. So I went in here and I said, has to match this vendor, has to match these model numbers, and that's it. It just never had a problem again. And then as new devices came onto the network, new devices got managed by SolarWinds, this would just add them to that job.
It's a great point. So as you mentioned, you can do it by vendor, machine type, OID, location, any of this information that's listed here, you can go ahead and pull and use as your selection criteria. So it's really flexible. It helps you, again, for certain devices that require special handling, you can leverage this to help ensure that you're doing that the way you want to. For the sake of this, I'm just going to select one node again just to walk through the UI here. Oh, I did not see. Didn't move it over. Don't open that. There we go. All right. So we moved over the node that we're interested in. Now we're going to go ahead and click next. So this is an area to spend some time on when you're setting this up. This is the notification details. These are incredibly important because this gives you all of the logs of what's happened, or an email, or it saves all those results to files, so you have some sort of historical context, especially if you're doing that at 2 a.m. and you're not there.
Yeah.
You probably want to have some record that, yes, it ran, here's what happened. I now know what occurred last night when I was sound asleep.
Yeah, and the beauty of that is that if this is, maybe this is something that is daily.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you don't need the email daily.
Right.
But maybe you want a weekly one. So you have a weekly job that basically does the same thing as the daily jobs. And like we said, if it pulls identical configs, it basically throws one away.
Yep.
So you can at the end say, just send me the weekly email, because the last thing you need is a million emails.
Yes, yeah, you definitely don't want to flood yourself with something that's happening quite frequently. That's not good. So here, though, highly recommend that if you're looking to automate your process, to leverage this tab and set it up properly so that you're keeping all of the records you need. Anyone asks you any questions, something does break, you have the paper trail to say, here's what happened, I have record, here's also the config, I downloaded it, I know what happened. Right?
Yep.
You've got yourself protected there. So once we've done that, here's where you were mentioning you can start to do some custom things with what you want to do with the config. So you're going to select the type of config that you're going to download from these devices. So you might have some custom config types for specialty devices that aren't listed out of the box. That's totally fine. You can select those. Here we're selecting running because we're doing it on a daily frequency. We don't want to pull startup necessarily. We'll do that once a week. Any job or any node that doesn't match this config type will be skipped. So that's something to be aware of. If you're running and you have Juniper or you have Palo Alto or something else, and you have a custom config type that doesn't apply to those, and you're trying to pull that in, it's not going to pull those in. It's going to skip those if it doesn't work for them. So if you have like a Cisco node and you have some custom config type that only works on Palo Alto, you don't have to worry about an error saying, oh gosh, I tried to pull in a Palo Alto config off my Cisco and it failed now. It's going to just move on to the next one.
Yeah, so we're actually going to check compatibility.
Yep.
And then we'll only actually pull that type of config that you request from the screen.
Yep. And then to your point earlier, here's where you can click only save the configs that have changed.
My favorite checkbox, because I also went through, this is job one, but once a week for me is I also just, as an absolute paranoia, worried about catastrophic failure, I would export my configs out to a file share. And I didn't need 75 copies of the same config, just with different date timestamps.
Right.
So this one actually allowed me to just make sure those were stored in the database. And then when I did my dump once a week, which we saw on the job list, I wasn't dumping as much. I was only dumping the necessary.
Exactly. And that also helps with database size. So you don't end up burning up a bunch of space. Yeah, it'll just balloon out of control if you're not careful. So what we're going to do is also determine what notification, if the config file is different. So we're going to, what kind of notification. We can do the last download config file, the selected type. We can do it off the baseline config file, startup config file. There's all these options to basically customize to make sure you're getting the right notification. So again, if you are not near the system and it's running, you have all the information you need when you come back online that, okay, this worked or it didn't work, and now I know the steps I need to take to go remediate that. And then once you hit next, you'll get a chance to review, and that's it.
That's it.
It's done. You don't have to do anything.
And then you can go back, and providing you check the box, say save a log. After it's completed, there will be a little link in the jobs list saying log.
Correct.
And you can just click on that and read the details. There it is, history.
Yeah, so we can click on any of these. Let's click on
one that actually finished.
Yeah, let's click on that. Let's go. I think some of these have. Let's take a look at this one here.
There we go.
So here, we can see this is the ASA maintenance recovery, a log of all the events that have occurred, and it just continues to grow as things change through it. And you can come in and you can look for the date time that you knew it run. You can find that on the page, and that's it. You get all of the history. You can save it as well. Close it.
The actual commands that run.
Yes.
So you actually have full transparency here. So even if the log on the endpoint device has been cleared, even if the keystrokes aren't being sent out to attack Xbox, even if all of these, this is something that you'll actually able to review as if it's basically a typing transcript, but done by the Orion system.
It is, yeah, essentially. Since we're executing all the commands, we can keep a history of them.
And any errors that come back. Thankfully, that one ran clean.
Yeah. They always run clean. There's never
Ever,
errors.
just 100% all the time. That's why we're here.
Yes. All right. Well, let's go ahead. Let's move on to the next one here. So let's talk a little bit about vulnerability protection. All right. So once you've already done all of your config, you've got your system, all your nodes added, you're backing all of them up, you know that your configs are all right. Now you need to start looking at, what about my system overall? Is it open to attack based on vulnerabilities that have been published? So one of the things that NCM will do is it'll take Cisco and Juniper devices and it'll match that firmware version to the published vulnerabilities that are available. All of the information that we're pulling in is from the NIST vulnerability database, so we're not coming up with our own system. It's using a well-established tracked database of all that information. We'll give you the vulnerability number, the severity, the score, and other details to help you determine, does this apply to me? Do I need to do any further investigation? And then, okay, what do I need to do now? If it does apply to me, how do I go about handling this?
Yeah, because sometimes it just doesn't apply. If it happens to only affect, I don't know, RIP v1 protocol, how many people, hopefully not many, how many people are still running RIP v1 in their infrastructure? Again, hopefully not many. So maybe you can be like, that doesn't apply to me.
Exactly. Maybe there's a function on the switch that you haven't enabled yet either.
Exactly.
All right, let's go ahead and show you that. So again, once you've already added the node to NCM, we can come over to our config summary. So this is effectively the dashboard for all of the nodes that are managed through NCM. So you get all of the information here in terms of the configuration snapshot, things related to compliance, and other things that we're not going to necessarily talk about in this session. But specifically, what I'm interested in is this little widget here called firmware vulnerabilities.
Yep. It's petrifying how long that list is. What is it? That we're seeing 5 or 6 things, and it's 74 pages long.
367 items.
Yeah, but we pull down the entire NIST list. The entire list. I was going to say NIST list, but it doesn't roll off the tongue easily. So we pull down the whole thing. So as ones are updated, even if it's from 5 years ago, or I think they started that in around 2014,
yeah, I think so.
something 2013, 14. If there's one that's an early one that all of a sudden still is relevant and it's been updated, we'll make sure it gets pulled in and checked against your systems.
Exactly. So like I said, what we get here is we're pulling in all of those IDs, the score, the severity, and then we're going to tell you how many nodes are technically targeted by each of those. And once you've drilled into one, so we'll drill into this first one here. It's a severity of 5, severity medium. It's scored about a 5. Now we'll go ahead and give you the summary of the actual CVE, so you can look in and understand what this is. So this is specifically for the FXOS and NXOS software. You can go ahead and read that. There's a link that links out to the CVE as well. So if you wanted to read more about it directly from their site, you can go ahead and open that in a new tab, and here you are. You get all that information. You can drill in from there.
Including whether or not it's been resolved, whether it's an open case, whether it applies to a very specific subset of things. Now, we try to bring that information in, but there may be that one detail we're not able to capture.
Yep, exactly. So you can read through all of that there. In addition, you can put some comments that you have on your own into each of these. So if you have a comment based around this, maybe it's this does not apply for the following reasons. You need to write it off so your security team says, okay, at least you reviewed it. Now I see why you say it's okay.
Audits don't mean fixing everything. Audits really mean documenting everything.
Correct.
So this is one of those ways you'd be like, this, maybe we don't have SNMP turned on the FXOS software. Maybe that's all you need, just to say that.
Yep. All right, cool. The other thing you can do is change the state. So if you've confirmed that this is a vulnerability, you're not sure it's still a potential, we'll always mark it as potential. You'll want to come in here manually and edit that to make sure it's confirmed or not. If it's not applicable, again, similar to the comment before, it might not be something that applies to your environment, and therefore it's something you don't have to worry about. You can go ahead and put that as not applicable. If you do know that it is and you have a planned remediation, maybe you're going to do a firmware upgrade or there's a setting that needs to be changed, whatever it is, you can mark it as remediation planned. If it's already been fixed, you can mark it as remediated, right? No longer a problem. Yep. We won't notify you about it anymore. Or you can click on waiver. The other thing that's important is making sure you select the right field here with the state.
Yeah, because like where I came from, we were very big on using 4500 CAT chassis. So Cisco Catalyst 4500 series chassis, but only a couple of them were running like SOUP 4 pluses or SOUP 6s, the routing ones. And a lot of them were just kind of access level switches.
Yep.
Basically glorified workgroup switches. But if I have a CVE that applies to the specific supervisor module, I want to make sure I select this, that this applies only to those devices.
Exactly. So you can come in, again, select your nodes. In this case, we only have one node that's affected, right? So we don't have to worry about that too much.
Yeah. So yes, all of them.
Yeah. Yes.
All one.
All one. Cool. So we can go through here. You can see that we can organize this as well by score. So if we're only interested in the top vulnerabilities, well, gosh, we have a lot of 10s. We can see those. We can see ones that are highlighted for the 15 nodes. If we were to click on that, it brings you to a list of all the nodes that are affected by the CVE. And then you can one by one drill into each of these and review it if you wanted to do it that way. Depending on how many CVEs you have, it take you to your node details. You can come over to config details and you'll see more information there. You can start to drill in. And here we go. Here's the list. So we can see, there it is. We have all the 10s that now are applying to this particular.
That's a really good example because that 10 is from 2006.
Yes.
So, and I don't think that was, no, it's one that creeps up every so often because it covers a large quantity of versions, if I remember right. I do remember right. So it actually does do a lot of different versions, and there's still a lot of this in the wild. So being able to have us check this for you instead of you have to go around with a checklist. Yep. Which, number one, you got to print that checklist, and then you got to log in, do everything on that checklist. Just let the software do it for you.
Exactly. And so one other thing here is you see that we have one node out of many, and NCM's already notifying because you came in through the node details. It's already making the decision that anything you apply here is just going to apply to this node. So make sure you select the right setting based on what you've done in your environment. All right. So one of the things is once you've already made your determination that there is something that you are vulnerable to a particular item, whatever it is, you need to start thinking your next steps in terms of how do you remediate that and begin to button it up. You don't want to leave that yourself exposed for too long, especially for the more severe ones. You could leave your environment vulnerable. That's not good.
No, please don't do that. Please don't do that.
Yes, please don't. We've heard that about many of those things too often in the news. It's something that we don't want to encourage. So one of the ways to rectify that is to upgrade to the newest version of the firmware that's available for those devices. So NCM here again helps. Instead of having to go to each device and manually type in and go through the upgrade process and walk through it one by one or have multiple sessions open and trying to manage it manually, you can use NCM's firmware upgrade. It will do more than just a standard script of execution. This basically does it in a way to do a lot of pre and post workflow, giving notifications, the log of the process as it goes through. It'll verify space and a few other things. So this all works for Cisco devices, iOS, NXOS, ASA, and I think a few others that I'm forgetting off the top of my head.
Probably, but basically anything that Cisco's released recently.
Pretty much.
We've tried to cover.
Yep. Juniper switches and Lenovo switches were just added in the latest release, so now we have capability to upgrade those. As well, if you notice that Juniper is also covered under the firmware vulnerabilities. Yep. So you got the full system there to be able to detect it and then also remediate it. So like I mentioned, you verify the space, you can reboot, you can back up the configs after the upgrade. Again, that's part of that workflow. You want to make sure you're constantly looking at those configs in case something changes when it gets a new version applied. Yeah. Something might have been reset in the way that they pushed out the firmware.
Absolutely. And then ultimately, the beauty of this is basically, we have automated the process that everyone's been doing for 15 years.
Yes.
And there were a lot of question marks in that process. Not that people didn't know what they were doing, but that there were a lot of steps, and each step you had to wait for a response from the device. It was, number one, check the version that's on there right now, make a backup of that file, then save the configs off that file. It's literally the list that everyone has been doing with their hand checklists. Yep. We're just saving you the headache again.
Yep, and we're saving you the headache of if you're trying to use scripts to automate this, you can run into some problems if you've messed a step or you're running too many in parallel. Now you bring down a portion of your environment, or God forbid, the entire environment now is affected. Yeah, you don't want to do any of that. We also log everything, so you have logs. You have some historic, again, that paper trail to come back on and look and see, did something fail? If it did, here's where it failed. I can see that. I can take actions to rectify that now, and it's isolated rather than having a widespread event where you're a little bit more.
And then you can target assuming it failed for a legitimate reason, then you can target fixing that particular endpoint and then running the upgrade wizard again. So you get, again, that paper trail on the one for the second time.
Exactly. So you can see that whole history. That's really important. So let's show you what the firmware upgrade looks like. Again, come back in, network configuration, firmware upgrades right there, right in front of your face. Really easy to find. And actually here in our demo environment, you can see we have had one that failed. So what you'll do is when you first get NCM and you're first setting it up, this will all be blank. You'll need to come in and set up your firmware upgrade. So you can come in, you want to create a new upgrade operation. There's a couple things you can do from this page. You can use one of the out-of-the-box templates. So we see we have a lot of Cisco devices here. We have a Juniper, we have some Lenovo. Maybe your vendor or your model isn't listed and you want to make sure that you've set it up properly and you want to customize the template a little bit.
So this begs the question, what kind of requirements? It needs to have a CLI interface.
Yep, it needs to have CLI.
And it needs to support like some type of file for distribution of the firmware and TFTP, SCP, one of the kind of standard protocols.
One of those standard protocols.
And in theory, you could write your own upgrade template anytime.
Yep. It's really straightforward. We have a lot that are actually shared. So to that point, you can come in, you put your name description, you enter in the command here. You can use the standard macro, which is all documented in the admin guide if you're interested in what those are. Or you can enter in your own. You can type in what the command is explicitly supposed to be rather than using the macros, which again, if you're doing something that looks like it's, for your environment, you don't necessarily see the model, highly encourage doing that. So again, CLI access is required for this to work. If you want to collect the boot variable information, config register, free space command, if there are other commands that you would like to have executed on that box when this process is occurring, this is where you would put it. Make sure this will
You
run
mean
those.
like sync to a neighbor or something like that?
Something like that. Yeah. If there's something you want to run in addition, yeah.
Okay.
To your point, here's the firmware upgrade. So if I have a firmware image type that I'm going to add, this is where I'm going to add the new one. I'm going to type this in, allow add new. The firmware upgrade command itself. So again, you can use the macros, but you'll want to make sure that you are specifying as much as possible if you are using something that's not listed, just to make sure that the right command is being executed. Pick your protocol. You want TFTP? You want SCP? You get to decide. And then you'll walk through each of these other commands. So deleting the firmware image, backing up the firmware image, updating the config register, updating the boot variables, the reboot, verifying the firmware image, verifying the backed up firmware image, and then verifying the upgrade. So all of this will run. So again, if you were imagine doing this manually, you'd be doing this all by hand in that session, trying to go through and make sure that you run each of these and you don't forget a step.
Yeah,
you're going to have to.
And we have. I mean, we all have. If you've upgraded even your 2621 as in your test lab, you've done this. It's painful. I will tell you the most painful part. Aside from the most catastrophic part is when you skip a step. That's really bad. The most painful part, though, is watching the pound signs or the dashes or whatever happens scroll across the window and then wrap and scroll across the window and wrap as you're watching these images come down over SCP or TFTP. That's the most painful part of this, especially on large images on the other side of slow WAN links.
Oh, yeah.
So don't watch it anymore. Let us watch it for you.
That's a good point. Yeah, you don't want to sit there. That's if you enjoy watching grass grow, it's a good thing to do. All right. Other upgrade options here. You can save the config to an NVRAM before the upgrade. You can back up the running and startup configs before. This is highly advised, right?
Please.
You want to make sure you do all this before you run an upgrade. How many times has it happened that a vendor has put out a firmware update and for whatever reason, it resets some of the config. It changes some settings somewhere because that's just something that the dev team, didn't notice or, forgot about when we pushed it out.
Yeah, it's happened. I've had it burn me on a couple of times, or commands that previously were out of the box defaulted off, now are out of the box defaulted on.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So what is that? The non-negation scenario? Something like that.
Yeah.
They actually have a term for it, but basically it just turns features on. You're like, I don't want that on there.
Right.
So
yeah, this will give you that ability to see it. You'll be able to see that snapshot and take a look at the difference.
Especially when you compare it to the now current config.
Yep.
You'll see the delta between those two.
Exactly. Again, we're going to look at we can have it verify the backed up firmware image integrity. These are the commands up here that are doing it. These are the actions. So once you've inputted the commands, then you can come down here and select what actions are relevant for me to take on this. Update the boot variable. You can reboot the device, so you can unmanage the device before reboot. You can show a warning if the reboot device after upgrade option is unchecked. So that's something to verify. And you can verify it and then back up and running and start up configs after the upgrade. So here's what we were talking about, where now you're able to look at the difference from the prior version before you pushed it out and the version right after you've confirmed that it's on. So you can get a good indication of whether that applied and worked exactly as you intended it to, and that you didn't break anything.
Yeah.
Because the worst case is it breaks something for someone that, well, you don't see, but your end users end up feeling.
Yeah, the worst thing is the pain that gets associated with end user calls. Actually, the pain is when you start getting these calls at 6 a.m. because they happen to be 2 time zones east of you.
Yep. Yeah, they're trying to come online, and now all of a sudden they can't access or do what it is they intended to do that morning.
Yeah, worst one I ever had was one that actually did someone, again, fat finger to command, and knocked the badging system offline, so no one could even get into the building. That was an interesting one to get around.
You sure anyone complained about that?
They did.
All right, so what I've done here is I've gone ahead and I clicked into one that said need review. This is basically a review test. So you'll see that we're under the upgrade options. This is further in the process of creating that template. So after you've named it and you've selected your template you're going to use, you would select your images, you select your nodes. Very similar format in selecting the nodes as you saw before. You can do just a simple click. You can do a broader click of a big group, or you can do the dynamic selection again, where you're picking some criteria that are required for you to want to push the upgrade. Maybe it's again, if it's attached to a vulnerability, it could be a particular model that you're trying to target. It could be a particular vendor if it's a really broad sweeping vulnerability that's been patched by this firmware upgrade. Whatever it is, this is where you would make that selection. You can see here we have the firmware version, the path to upload image is something we need to input here. We have all the upgrade options. And then in this case, we would say we've confirmed this, we've reviewed it. And when we hit next, it's going to go ahead and take us to the notification. So we can say confirmed. No, it's not going to let click confirm, but in this case, it won't let me because it's on the demo environment. But
yeah, we lock a lot down.
Yeah. So you'd be able to go into notifications, and this is again where you're doing the logs, you're creating the email notifications, and for something like this, you're probably going to want to do the email notifications.
Yeah,
you really want to make sure you're getting.
Especially if this happens to be multiple devices. For a single device like this, you could do this, and again, if you want to watch paint dry, you can sit here and watch it progress, which is fine. But if you're doing this because there is a vulnerability that's been detected, and you need to do all of your 29 21s, and you happen to have branches and they're all over the place, then yeah, just get it to do the work and send you an email when it's complete.
Exactly. Save yourself the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to click in here, and we can see this is, again, what the logs, very similar format. We're going to keep scrolling history. This is the one that actually failed. We can see that it failed on the NEWY 2811 WAN. So it's New York, some WAN device. It's no longer, it didn't work. So we can come into the logs and we can see, oh, here's the error. It didn't find the image on the server.
Okay, so that's pretty obvious from the exclamation points and the dots.
Yep.
That the connection was just bad. So this could be we're throwing packets away, we've got some type of problem. This is something that is not a problem necessarily with the firmware or the upgrade process, but the link there. So ways you could get around this is locally copy the firmware over there and do these things, but this one require intervention of some kind.
Exactly. But at least you would know because now you've kept the log.
And it also stopped.
Yeah.
That's I know it sounds silly, but this is a very important part, is that if it runs into a problem during this upgrade process at any stage, it will hit the brakes and be like, no, something's gone sideways. It's, to me, to go with the car analogy again, this is the equivalent of driving 90 miles down the highway and seeing the check engine light on and then immediately pulling over and checking it.
Yep.
It stops everything. That way you're not going 90 miles an hour and, the entire transmission blows up.
Yep. Yeah, that would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll move on to the last thing. Again, if there's questions on those, keep asking. It seems like we've got a
We've got a great bunch of questions in here.
Fantastic. All right, so the last one is config drift. So we talked a little bit about managing your configs for firmware upgrade, right? You want to take it pre and post. So make sure that nothing's changed from the firmware modifying a setting or enabling something you didn't expect to be enabled. Conversely, there's also what happens in your environment just over time. People make modifications. If you have a bigger group of people that have access to the device, whether it's like a firewall, now they need to go add an IP that now needs to have added access to a particular route into the environment, or they're adding whatever it is, something that's been changed or modified by people for legitimate business reasons, but has now modified your base config, right? Your golden template. So with NCM, we have a notion of something called baselines, and specifically baselines for config. Normally that's performance related. In this case, we're talking about the actual content of the config that's going to the appliance. We pull all that in. We can do a full config file. So if you want to just baseline a 2811 or 3650 or whatever it is, 3050, and you just want to say, this is my golden template for every single one of these, they must match this because I have duplicate settings across multiple environments or multiple locations. Great, you can do that. You apply to each of them and it'll work. Or if you just have a snippet of VLAN, SNMP setting, whatever it is, you want to make sure that's all set the same. Then you can go ahead and implement that.
Every router has to have the WAN interface on 00 instead of 01.
Exactly.
Dumb little things like that. But these are the things that you can build in, and then you can know when devices don't happen to apply by this.
Exactly. It's super easy to do. So I'll show that. Well, then one other piece is the compliance policy. So let's say you're beyond just monitoring, right? In this case, you're setting baselines to monitor the drift, but now you actually need to take a more active approach. Going back to the security and the vulnerability and the threat for someone doing something to your environment. Certain things need to be set based on regulatory standards, corporate standards, personal standards of how you're running to make sure that you don't end up violating any laws or allowing people into your environment that shouldn't be allowed in.
Or even just to speed up troubleshooting, because if every single one of my devices is configured the same, it doesn't matter which 3750, 3850 switch I jump on, whichever stack that happens to be, wherever it is in my infrastructure, I know that VLAN 2 is going to be this and VLAN 5 is going to be that. And you will know that. So that's the kind of we keep talking about compliance policies, and I know that there's a lot of people in the world who are bound by PCI DSS, and they're bound by HIPAA and SOX and Sarbanes-Oxley and all these. Everyone's got that. But even if you're a completely privately held company, compliance policies are a good thing.
Yes.
They're really not that difficult to set up. They're not that difficult to work with. The remediation stuff can be a little tricky because you've got to have a little bit of skill with regex, but it's worth the investment of time to learn that kind of stuff. But really what it gets down to is if you make sure every single device everywhere in your infrastructure is built the same way, it speeds up your troubleshooting so much.
It does. It does. So the remediation is a big thing. And I think that when we go through this, one of the pieces I would advise, at least I've seen with people who've used this, baselines are great for broad sweeping config monitoring. If you're a little hesitant or shy about implementing, complex scripts to remediate something, you can make those more targeted to the things that are the most critical to your environment. So you don't have to set them up on every device for every type of config, for every piece of content. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Use baselines to monitor what you can that are non-critical, that you need to just watch and make sure stay the same over time. And then when they deviate, you can rectify.
Yep.
And for those things that are very important, you can spend your time to build the proper scripts and rules and policies to manage that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this turns into a time management job.
It does.
Let the system manage your time for you better.
Yep. And then as we've mentioned, config snapshots show the config to configure. So beyond just looking at baselines and beyond just looking at compliance policies, you can also see drift just by evaluating one config versus another. Let's go ahead and show you. I'll start on the config to config because I think that fits our workflow a little bit from where we were earlier. So similar spot to where we were when we were downloading the config manually. We can actually come in and click on 2 nodes or more. In this case, I'm only going to click on 2. And I can compare the 2 configs right there.
Now, you checked a router and a switch.
I did.
Okay. Just making sure.
So the reason I did this, there's actually sometimes this happens in environments, and I think this is one advantage with NCM. You'll be able to easily detect that you've now made a mistake with what it is you're trying to compare. So when you're running through a list, maybe you don't have the names of the systems in your name. Maybe you have some other naming convention, whatever it is. You may not notice that you've clicked the 2 wrong devices. One of the things that NCM is going to do is that it's going to highlight the changes, but it's going to do a lot of this collapsing of the lines. Mm-hmm. So if you end up with looking at 2 disparate devices trying to do that drift monitoring, it's not going to try and analyze the whole thing. It's basically going to show you some lines and then go, wait a minute, I think you made a mistake.
Yeah.
Let's go back and try that again. So if we go back, we can actually click off that one now. Now I can compare these 2.
Because the last thing you need is the sky is falling scenario when you're looking at separate devices that actually, and forget separate devices, because sometimes you do need to compare those. In fact, it's a great use case for this particular feature, but you don't necessarily need to compare a firewall with a router, or even worse, a firewall with a switch, because they don't do the same thing.
Yep.
But comparing switch A to switch B, well, if they're supposed to be set up in near identical, except of course like IP, host name,
of course,
basic stuff, then comparing them is actually a really good use of this.
Yep, and that's what we can see here. So one of the things, I'll talk a little bit about the config diff first, then I'll mention some things here that we could do even to optimize this here. Mm-hmm. So one of the things with the config diff in this newest release that just came out actually a couple weeks ago, we highlight all of the changes that occur within the config, and then we collapse anything that's +5 above or +5 below those changes. So we're not showing you a bunch of lines that don't have anything that's modified. If there is a reason to look into those, you can expand them to get some better context of where does this change reside? Like, where does it live? Let me go ahead and expand that.
But these 2 look to be relatively similar.
Yep.
I mean, the things we just listed out, the host name is different. The secret's obviously different because the way it's encrypted. Same thing with a user, but there's nothing here that's makes me want to drink battery acid yet.
Nothing too crazy. And for me, if I look at this, I see an opportunity here to use our global ignore functionality here on the host name. So you don't actually see any of that because
you can say I don't care about host names.
Exactly.
In other words, when you see the host name line, like we did there, because that will constantly change.
Right. So you can see that we have a setting in NCM that allows you to ignore lines based on regex. So in this case, we are ignoring all of the last configuration change line because, well, of course that's going to change, right? I mean, if you're pulling this in daily, that's irrelevant. But this at least highlights that, hey, it's gray. This is different. This is being ignored, just so you don't have to worry about like, hey, it is different. Why isn't highlighting? No, it's gray. Tells you it's been ignored. We could do that for host name here, but so this is the config to config capability. So you just come in, click the 2 nodes, compare them. Super easy to use. It'll come up, populate, and you can scroll down through the entirety of the config and look at all the differences. And with the way that it collapses lines now, it makes it really, really easy to find those differences. So we'll talk a little bit about a different workflow. We talked about monitoring and then more actively managing changes in your config drift. So on the monitoring side, we have the baseline functionality, which this is a separate tab, so I'll talk about that. When we have a config that we know out of the device that's good. So I think this running here from the 27th to 4 a.m., that's probably a good one. I think it seems to be good. So let's promote that. Well, in this case we can't, but we would promote that and we'd be creating a new config baseline. This now becomes a template for us to use as kind of the gold standard across our entire environment. What it'll do is it'll take you to this new page where it'll take the name of that particular node. So in this case, this is from one of our WAN. It's the running config, so it's right there appended as the suffix. And then you can create a description and it'll pre-populate some of these fields. So it's going to pull in the entirety of the config. Here we have 425 pages of lines that might be worthwhile evaluating in this.
Well, that's a lot.
It is a lot. Well, there's some cool tricks we can do there.
Okay.
When you're doing this, if you're pulling in a full baseline, you're going to want to select things like exact match because then you're looking at 1 to whatever the final line number is, 1 to 1,000. So if anything gets appended above 1, NCM now knows, hey, wait a minute, I should evaluate. That's probably some added content. There might be differences in the line somewhere within the config file. I need to evaluate, run my algorithm, make sure nothing's changed.
Okay, got it.
If you're looking at a snippet, so VLAN or some other setting, you're going to want to click this so that it knows that that field isn't going to match the 1 through 10 lines, right? It's going to be somewhere nested in that config file, and it'll hunt for that within the configuration and then highlight the differences. If you're creating new, you'll be able to paste it in, just copy paste. If you're looking to browse, you have a file that's on your local machine, you know this is the good config, you can browse that, pull it in, it applies it. We mentioned the global comparison criteria. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is where you want to do things like host name, last config change, any of those basic things that are on almost every config file that are going to change device to device. You don't want to pay attention to those. You want to be able to, though, click different lines, right?
Yeah.
There's probably other things in here you don't want to compare. So, let's assume that this wasn't being ignored by global comparison. I could manually come in and select those lines.
Okay, so question for me, is this going to universally skip lines 2, 3, and 4? Or is this going to know to skip lines that match that language?
It's going to be lines that match that language. So it's
Even
going to look
better.
for that content and say, oh, this content moved 3 lines down. Now I'm going to indicate on that baseline comparison with these hash lines that I've now moved. I haven't been modified.
So we're not actually looking at like the line number. That's irrelevant. That's just for us visually working with this to have a reference.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Give you a reference and then also make it a little easier when you're trying to pull in. Maybe there's a line you didn't mean to click. You can figure out where that is.
That's true.
It's
Yeah.
really, other than navigation, it's not doing much.
Okay.
You could come in here. Again, you said there's a lot of pages. Yeah, I agree with you. Well, if I'm looking for something IP related, I can search for that. So now I can come in and select certain fields that are based on that I don't need anymore. And I'm done. So I will ignore all of those fields now as well.
Wow.
I can assign that to nodes. I can pick the vendor, the status, the machine type, the type of running config.
Okay, so right now this is only set to this WAN router.
Yep.
But if we go through this and say, no, this is actually a baseline for all of our WAN routers, except we tell it to ignore like the circuit ID and the IP address and possibly the next hop for our route tables, we could, in theory, assign it to all of our WAN devices.
We could. If you had multiple, you can come in. So you could select it by vendor and then drill down from there if you wanted to.
Wow. Okay,
So
cool.
it's purely up to whatever is in your mind. Yeah, it's just, again, helping you set it up so that you're monitoring it and you don't have to manually come back and do this later, because that would be a pain.
Yeah, and then you can come back and maybe you missed a line and you can just edit the existing, what are we calling these? Is this a template?
Yeah, baseline template. Yeah.
Basically, so we go and you can edit your baseline template for that series of devices or that roll of devices in your infrastructure.
Yep.
And just edit it and say, yeah, I totally forgot this line, add this line, or we've added a QoS policy that needs to be everywhere. So here it is on one, make sure it's on all of them.
Yep. So you'll want to run that. And then if you have any changes or you've added a device, a new configs, and you want to update your baseline, you just click that, click update, and it'll rerun and evaluate that baseline against all of those nodes.
Okay, cool.
If you click in and you see something that's mismatched and you click mismatched lines, you get, again, a diff. So we can see we're ignoring the first 3 lines. And now we for sure have an added line here. Not just by line number, but by there was no content there. Right? Enable secrets here. It's no longer line 22. So it knows.
So it knows.
It moved. So it moved with it and
Okay.
then indicated that 22 was the added.
Okay, well, that's fine. It should be added, but we should also be logging. So it's good that it was added.
Yes. Yeah. So it tells you like it's not only it moved down. That gray
Yeah.
hashing indicates it's now been adjusted.
Yep. That way we're not comparing line 21 from config yesterday to line 21 of config today because they could be completely irrelevantly different.
Correct. So let's touch on, I'm not going to go too deep into compliance because we could be there for days
Yeah.
talking about how all this can do, but let's look at compliance reports. So baselines are for monitoring. They give you the idea of what's drifting and what's changing, and you can go in and do that. Diff compliance are more targeted. They're more focused. Usually they're standards based, DISA-STIG, PCI, whatever it is. If you have one that you're following that's not listed, you can create your own, but usually they're more specific and constrained based on that. What we use in NCM is we create rules. And what we see here is next to this little ruler, get it, ruler. We have different things. We have disable reverse telnet. We have this line setting, session timeout, disable IP. All these are rules that were created and then applied to each of these little policies with the P next to them. So this is console settings. So this is looking at 120 configs that are applied based on this policy. And then this is flood prevention. So these are the login delay, failure. So you're assigning a rule to a policy, and then within a a report, you can see multiple policies. So if you're interested in seeing 6 policies worth of information, you can pull those into a report and it just reports out on it.
So I can actually harvest, forgive the language, but I could harvest these policies and these rules that were already written somewhere else and build a report that's specific to my organization.
Correct. And
Okay.
you can mix and match. It's completely customizable. You can move rules out of policies. You can move them in. It's totally flexible based on whatever your environment. So it could even be different regions may have a few rules or policies that apply or don't apply to them, and you need to make modifications for those different locations. You can go ahead and do that. You just create one for each one, and it can collect that into its given report, and you're good.
Yeah.
You're off and running. What we'll do is we'll give you a status. Red is usually bad. You don't want that.
But
right?
you get to determine this.
This is all determined. Yes. This is
Okay.
based on your setting.
But this is the Cisco policy report, but the stuff from the NIST or the PCI DSS, those are actually determined by those governing bodies, the criticality.
Well, and you can customize this too for your environment. So if you feel that something from the standard report doesn't warrant being marked as a red exclamation point, and it's more notification or warning state like a yellow triangle, you can go ahead and do that and make it that. But probably not the right thing to do, but it's completely customizable.
Yeah.
So you can change that.
I see taking these down a level as a bad thing, but maybe certain things taking up a level.
Right.
If you're in a high security environment and let's just say the login delay is not in there, but is highly recommended for secure environments, then you can go and edit this rule and say, no. When this rule is violated, this is a critical problem.
It is.
And then all of a sudden your reports all get updated with that.
Yep. So we can actually click into that one. So each one of these, indicators is clickable, and it'll give you the conditions that were evaluated and then tell you what happened. So in this case, we have a pattern login delay 90 was just not found. And we have a couple options here that I don't know if anyone caught right under management. There's something called execute remediation script on this node or execute remediation script on all nodes. Basically what this is saying is if you've gone into this rule and you've created a remediation script, you either have the option of having NCM saying, hey, I found a violation that's something that's highly critical. We're going to go ahead and execute this for you based on your setting. Or you can have it say, I want to be notified in my report first. And then when I review this, then I want the option of pushing out the remediation. So I know that it's doing it, right? Maybe you don't want it automatically doing it. That's fine, especially if it's informational or warning. But more critical things, you might want the system to go ahead and rectify those, especially if they're leaving you vulnerable. That's not a good thing.
I'll tell you a silly one in here that I put in my policy. BPDU guard.
Really?
Yeah, it sounds silly, but we didn't. But a couple switches, if we forgot to enable BPDU guard on the endpoints, then people would plug in their airport router they got at Christmas time, and then all of a sudden we have broadcast storms. So it was just easy. It was easier to actually have a policy in here say, you know what, make sure this exists on every switch, and then if it doesn't have the remediation line that says now make this exist on every switch.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I know we're going to run out of time. Just going to quickly rack through the rule here because I want to show exactly the power of the rule. So this is under the NIST access list external routing rule that's pre-created. We have name, description. This is that alert level I was mentioning. It's completely selectable. Other than green, right? Green is up to NCM to determine based on it saying, oh, it
basically
complies.
no matches.
Yeah, you want the compliance there, and then that'll go green. So you have warning, informational, and critical. It'll tell you which folder you want to save in. These are basically just folders to group the rules so you have some logical method of looking for it later. Here's where it gets powerful. You can come in, and in this case, we're looking for string is not found. We're using the advanced config search, regular expressions, and we're using and logic across for each of these. So it must contain the following criteria based on this regex, and it must contain the following router setting and this list. So it's going to evaluate each one of these and then report back as to the status. So you can come up with very complex config search strings. You can come up with very simplified. It's purely up to you. In conjunction with that, you can also determine if you want it to look through the entire config file or if it's just looking for a particular block. And in that case, I can say, I know that this particular setting lives in this section of the config. I only want you to look here. And then you can specify that.
That there is amazing. Just to be able to look at, like, say, your TACAX definition, little things like that. Being able to say, hey, I need to make sure TACAX is defined and has these 3 servers listed in it, even if it doesn't actually have them in this order.
Yeah. Well, and it'll help too. So if you come down here and you put in a remediation script, and you want to make sure you're not fixing things that are not related and are under a different part of the config that should not be touched, set up a config block, constrain it, and then it only remediate there what it's constrained to.
Exactly, because it's all it's checking to start with.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think that is all we
That is
had from
done.
here.
I have been answering a slew of questions directly to people, but I think we have some other questions. David, are you still with us?
I'm here. Yeah, great demo, man. If I had this tool when I was a network admin, life would have been just so much easier. I love the back and forth, the discussion, the demo. Really, really great presentation. Thank you, guys. We do have some questions here for you. One of them is, what about comparing portions of a configuration? Can you compare VLAN or routing setups?
Yeah. So that's part of the baselines functionality, where if you wanted to compare, if you want to take a baseline and create a VLAN or something like that as a snippet, you would take the 6 lines or 5 lines or 15 lines, and then you could apply to each of the nodes that are you wanted to evaluate that against. And then it'll report out, and you can see the diff on that and go in and look and see that snippet diff.
Mm-hmm. Especially
Okay.
useful in data centers.
Yes, yeah, big time.
Extremely useful where you got a bunch of Nexus 7Ks and 5Ks
Yep.
participating with the FEX extenders. You've got to make sure your VLANs and your port channels. Port channels is another excellent example of that, and the VPCs.
I was going to say ACLs or
Oh, yeah.
policies out of a firewall, fantastic use case for that.
Mhm.
Nice. Okay. Seth is asking, what about backing up configurations? Can this help with that in some way?
I can cheat on this. So yes and no. So here's how I did it. I ran dual data center, and I had an Orion polling engine in each. And the one would pull everything basically east of the Mississippi, one would pull everything west of the Mississippi, and the file store I put them on replicated between the 2 locations. So every week I would export them out. They would replicate between the 2. And I also turned on, which we didn't have time to cover, real-time change notification.
Right.
So real-time change notification is a checkbox and like a 3-step wizard, I think. I may be talking out of class.
It's pretty short.
It's real short.
Yep.
Basically, you say, hey, if you get a syslog or a trap that matches this kind of language, download a config right now.
Yep.
No, don't wait 5 minutes. Right now. Get the config. And the way I normally used to do it, whenever you used to see the messages that came out of the syslogs or traps, were typically, hey, someone has just exited config mode. In Cisco, I worked primarily with Cisco, but there's matching ones for other vendors.
Yep.
You can basically say, oh, that log came into Orion. Yeah, let's go ahead and go and get a config right now.
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. And so, I mean, I know we're running out of time here. There's a lot of great questions coming in, a lot of great comments as well. Before we go, what's the URL if somebody wants to try this out for themselves?
Well, the easiest way to get it, you can go to, if you want to kick the tires but not actually running in your environment, you can go to oriondemo.solarwinds.com. That's a great place to go in. Just hit OK with the login creds that are pre-populated for you, and you get to kick the tires. But realistically, if you want more information and actually really try it in your environment, even against a small segment, go to solarwinds.com/NCM. That's for Network Configuration Manager.
Yep. You can do a free trial demo of that.
And that is that free trial is good for 30 days. So even if you don't love the product, you can at least capture a backup right now of everything in your infrastructure.
Very nice. Really powerful tool. Before we go, I should announce the winner of the Amazon $300 gift card on today's live event is Mark Kryenhagen from Ohio. Congratulations, Mark.
Congratulations,
Kryenhagen. Yeah, excellent. Well, it's been a great demo. It's been a great event. Kevin and Jonathan, thank you so much for being on today.
Oh, David, thanks for having us.
Yep. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for attending today's SolarWinds webinar. I hope to see you on the next event. Have a great day.